I am so very pleased to be able to reflect on the life of what I consider to be a great Exumian and by extension a great Bahamian, Gorge Smith. I was a very young boy during the years when the Bahamas was struggling towards the movement for majority rule. And believe for the first time I came into contact with Mr. Gorge Smith, the Honorable Gorge Smith, would have been the times leading up to the 1968 general elections. This would have been the elections that would have been held after the Progressive Liberal Party had already won the majority rule in 1967. But I think that one of the members of Parliament for the Kemp Road area, Uriah McPhee, passed away, and then the then Prime Minister or Premier, Sir Lyndon Pinley, called another election in 1968. This would be the beginning of when I would get to know one Gorge Smith. I actually had some relatives that lived down in the western district of Exuma in the Steventon area, and I remember me and my siblings, we went down to a family member in Steventon, and when we looked up on the wall, there was a picture there of what I would consider at that time to be a white man. It's very strange because during that time, most of those persons who were white or of a lighter hue were considered to be attached to the then UBP party. But this particular man, we consider to be a white man, was his picture was stuck on my family's house wall, and that was the beginning of my getting to know who Gorge Smith was. I believe it would be safe to say that during that time, it probably would have been safe for him, and he could have joined the minority movement at that particular time, and he probably would have been well off just to support that party during that time. But interestingly enough, this man decided that he would actually cast his lot with the majority who were actually at that time, I would call them oppressed. The minority was leading the majority. They had just won, and now they were going back into another election. But the whole idea was that there had to have been something that moved this one Gorge Smith to cast his lot with the oppressed, with the poor, with the downtrodden of his hometown, Exuma, and indeed the Bahamas. He chose to be a fighter for the little man. And that's what I remember as a young boy about Gorge Smith, that he was not one. Matter of fact, most of the founding fathers at that time, they did not join the political movement for what they could get. Matter of fact, they were giving up a whole lot. And so he did not join a political organization to enrich himself. But it is very obvious over his many years of representing Rollville constituency in Exuma has proven that Gorge was all about helping people. It's amazing today that this, I believe, is a little lost in our politics of today, where so many persons are in it for what I can get. Here is a man who was genuinely concerned about the well-being of the small man. That's the difference, I believe, between what I consider to be the politicians of today in any number of areas, is that those men went to give rather than to get. That was who George Smith was. He represented Exuma well. The next thing about George that I came to understand was I, at that time, had just come down to Nassau to go to the government high school as the country then was preparing to go towards independence. And I would recall that he, at that time, I believed, worked in the office of the Prime Minister as a parliamentary secretary. And Sir Lyndon at that time thought it wise or worthy to make George Smith the chairman of our first independence committee. This too would have demonstrated who George was. It meant that Sir Lyndon thought that this young man was so widely known, widely hailed as he traveled with him all through the Bahamas, that he could put him in charge of our first independence celebrations. And my, what a celebration it was. George Smith did a fantastic job of leading that committee and putting on our first independence celebrations some 50 years ago. And he did not stop. He did not tire in his efforts to continue to work to help his people. Matter of fact, I believe that George's legacy in Exuma, in the Western District, would be inextricably tied to two bridges that he was responsible for building. You see, the people of Baratari were cut off from the mainland at that time. And they were cut off by two pieces of, you'd call them keys. And they would have to actually ferry their boat either to Rollville from Baratari or from these points in order for them to make one journey to what we call town, to Georgetown, to do their shopping or to go to work or whatever they were going to do. This was a huge undertaking at that time. George took it on and he got the job done. He didn't build one bridge, but he built two bridges that connected Baratari to the mainland. And believe me, for those who lived there, this was something I believe that they could never ever forget. They were eternally grateful for George's efforts in working on behalf of those people, working on behalf of the small man. That, I believe, was George's legacy. Let me close by saying that George, though he was representing the Western District, at that time, the Honorable Livingston Coakley was representing Georgetown, the eastern part of Exuma. In 1972, when I left home, there was no high school there. Matter of fact, that's why I left Exuma, because there was no high school, and my parents wanted me to further my education. And during those years, you had to pass the common entrance if you wanted to come to the government high school. And so in 1972, I did pass and I did come down to the government high school. But those two Exumians, Livingston Coakley, joined by George Smith, wanted to see that high school education was available in Exuma. And I believe by the year 1974, the Exuma Senior High School, as it was called at that time, was opened. And George, I believe, had a whole lot to do with assisting in that happening. Here was a man that always thought about how he can better his homeland. What great contributions from this man, a man who loved people. It amazes me today that so many persons want to get into politics, but they don't love people. George was quintessential in this, relating to people. The people loved him because George could go into someone's house in Exuma while they're cooking and go into their pot, drink it from there, switch it from the peaches can, and just a down-to-earth, good human being. All of us have our flaws, but certainly the value, the good that George brought to Exuma and this country far outweighs any of the negatives. I truly thank God for him, for how he represented my island, for what he saw Exuma to be, and he continued to have many plans to see Exuma continue to grow from strength to strength. I understand that from the Exuma, we used to be the onion capital, and that is on our coat of arms for Exuma, the onion. George was continuously working, since we are not the onion capital anymore. We don't grow onions like we used to. But he wanted to be able to change that coat of arms to reflect what Exuma really represents with respect to sloop sailing. He wanted that coat of arms to represent the national regatta and also the beautiful turquoise waters of the Exumas, the best that you can find anywhere. So we hail this great Exumian. We honor him certainly for his many contributions that he would have made to Exuma and to his country, even as he represented us, I believe, at the London meeting when we went to get our independence. George Smith's name will forever be etched in the annals of our history of this country. What a great human being. What a great Exumian. What a great Bahamian. May his soul rest in peace.
We will now hear from Everin Hart.
The Honorable George A. Smith. I guess he and I got into one another in the early 60s. George was this handsome white boy in Exuma selling insurance. I can't remember what company it was. But he took the fancy of all of us, especially those of us who lived in Rollville, because for us, a white man was a novelty. We didn't see many white people out there. And here was this white man who was true to community, getting friendly with all the people selling insurance and what have you. And so George really became one of us. You know, he could walk in your house and you were cooking, he'd go in your kitchen, raise the pot up and see what you were cooking. And sometimes George would just take a spoon, take a plate and help himself. And you know, we as a people, we were not used to this not coming from white people. So George was really a big hit. And he and I got in, and you know, I don't know whether I was his pet, his brother, or what have you, but I could say throughout his life until he died, we lived as brothers. He and I had many experiences when he became a politician and decided that he was going to run for the Parliament. He was up against two white people, or we might want to say two Conky Joes. We had Mr. Bobby Simonet, who was the Member of Parliament for Georgetown, and we had Mr. Frederick Brown, who was the Member of Parliament for the Exuma Keys. And all of them were lovable persons. I have to give that to them, especially Frederick Brown. He was a lovable fellow, and I think the people in the Exuma Keys really loved him. So George did well. And when the constituency was split up in two, and George was given the privilege to run for what was then the Rollville constituency, man, let me tell you, people in Rollville flocked to him. He missed Rollville in 1967. But in 1968, when he ran, George won hands down. And I want to say that, and I've said this before, in my time, George Smith was one of the best MPs that we've had in that area. And so far, nobody's been able to match him. He is still number one in my book and in the book of many people. He was passionate. You know, George was that type of fellow who, you know, if you had a pain, George would try and find the aspirin to ease your pain. And he loved helping downtrodden people. Rollville at the time was probably one of the most downtrodden or most backward community on the mainland of Exuma. And when George Smith came out of politics, that is active politics, Rollville was right up there among all of the communities. We had everything that everybody else had: electricity, water, roads, upgraded government buildings, and you know, many of our young people were working with the government and, you know, corporations and what have you. So George really put Rollville people, and no one could deny that, he put us on a level with everybody else. I had the good fortune to work with him as a Family Island Commissioner when I was appointed in 1988. George was then the Minister of Local Government. And I always remember when I got appointed, he called me into his office and he said, "Now, Everett, let me tell you something. If you want to be a good commissioner, you just be a commissioner. Don't try to be nothing else. And if you try to be that, you will succeed." And I have to say that I followed his lines, and I started off as an assistant commissioner in 19 78. And 6 years later, I was a senior commissioner. Every 2 years, I got a promotion, not because I knew him, but because I followed what he said. Be yourself. So, you know, I'm saddened to know that I've got to come here to speak like this on his behalf after he's gone, because, you know, George was supposed to speak at my funeral. That was the agreement we had. I wasn't supposed to be speaking on behalf of him. After he died, he was supposed to speak on my behalf as I knew him. But I guess God's plan was that, no, this was not to be. It would be the other way around. And to his family, who also are my family, because as I said, George and I lived as brothers, and all his siblings became my family. His brother Robert, Richard, all those, Philip, they were brothers. His children, Gina and Gigi, Andrew, they grew up with my children. So we were just part of this family. And George and I guess every week, if I didn't hear from him or he didn't hear from me, one of us would give the other a call. And he would call to find out how Exuma was. And even though he was not the member of parliament for Exuma, George was always interested in knowing what was happening in Exuma, who was doing what. And, you know, if things were not right, he would say so. I'm not happy about this, blah, blah, blah. So we've lost a good MP, I'd say that. We've lost, in my book, as I said before, one of the best. And his shoes are going to be hard to fill. Going to be very hard to fill because they're big shoes. But those who are coming behind, I would say to them, there's some things of George you need to find out and follow his cue. And if you follow his cue, because he was a success. And I always say, if you want to be successful, you do what successful people do. And for those who are in the business, including the present member of parliament, I say to him, you follow George's cue and you will be successful. He was down to earth. You know, he could walk with kings, but he had no problem getting down to the floor if he had to. I recall on several occasions when I traveled with him throughout the Exuma Keys. We stayed in conditions way below what you expect the Member of Parliament to be staying, because the Exuma Keys at that time were not as built up as they are today. I remember one time we went into Farmer's Key, he and I, and they didn't have running water like they do today. Everybody used water from a big rainwater tank on Farmer's Key. And when that rainwater tank was dry, people went over to big Farmer's Key and brought water from a well over there. And this occasion, we were there spending the night in Little Farmer's Key. And of course, there was no water in the tank. So George and I decided, well, we'll go over to Big Farmer's Key and take a bath. So we had one of the little boys, I believe, one of Mrs. Corinne Spain's sons or grandson, I recall, took us over in a little boat, because we were staying at our house. And we went to this little well. She gave us towels and soap and what have you. So when we got there, we had to decide who was going to bathe first. So it ended up that George got the nod. I said, okay, you bathe first, which meant that I had to dip the water from the well, come over and pour water over him, naked as he was, And while I poured water on him, he bathed. And then when he was through, I stripped, and he brought water and poured over me, and I bathed. But you know, it didn't take anything of us. We were quite happy with that. All right, we were quite happy with that, and that was George. He lived for politics. He lived for Exuma. I mean, Exuma was his. I mean, after his family and his God, Exuma was next. And when it came to Exuma, I come from Rollville. Let me tell you, Rollville was his heartstring. So we realized that we lost a good MP, we lost a good man, but we pray that his soul is resting in peace. And George, you were not just a friend, you were my brother. We will miss you. But we know that while you were here, you did your best to dry every tear from people's eyes, to fill every hungry stomach, and to put money in every empty pocket. We'll miss you, but we say thank you, and we thank God for sending you to us, because of you, I was encouraged to make some other steps, and I ended up being where I was, because wherever I went, George was always there, monitoring my movement and making sure that I was doing what I was supposed to do.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our program, Jones and Company. I'm Christian Jones, your host, and we're joined by our co-host, Mr. Godfrey Enyas, as well as a special guest today, the Honorable George A. Smith. Good evening, Mr. Smith, and welcome to Jones and Company.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to be in the company of two very accomplished and distinguished Bahamian gentlemen.
Thank you, and you two gentlemen, far more accomplished than I. It is a great privilege to be able to sit in your midst this evening. Mr. Smith, you are a former parliamentarian. You served the constituency of Exuma for nearly 3 decades. You served in the cabinet of Sir Lyndon Pindling for over a decade, as well as you were the secretary to Mr. Pindling in 1972 and a delegate to the London Conference on Independence in December 1972. And we've asked you to appear on our show here today, given the fact that you recently have received, or recently has been announced, the intention of the Prime Minister to appoint you on the committee in charge of planning the 50th anniversary celebrations, as well as it has been announced that the Prime Minister intends to appoint you ambassador to the country of Singapore. So we congratulate you, and I just want to start by taking you back to December 1972, or even before then, and this lead up to what was this historical event nearly 50 years ago, in a manner as visceral as possible. If you can just recollect those events.
The elections that determine in 1972 whether we are to proceed to independence or not was the end of a tremendously long struggle by the Bahamian people, beginning with those gallant sons of the Bahamas who at the time were enslaved. Pompey and other leaders in the enslaved communities in Exuma, New Providence, Cat Island, Eleuthera, Abaco, wherever the enslaved were kept, fought against the treatment of themselves and their families. They lit among the enslaved people a spark that desired freedom, as is the right of all human beings. Their struggle eventually was realized in the victory when the enslaved people won their freedom in 1834, but still then they had to pay earn money for the owners of the enslaved community and do an indentureship for some 4 years, I believe. When you look from that period to so many events that led up to January 10, 1967, the struggle of the people who in 1942 felt disadvantaged because the Bahamians were paid less money than the foreign who were working at the Windsor Field airfield, and the incident occurred that got translated by the then British government as a riot. It wasn't a riot. Those were people who were with some element of energy fighting for their rights for fair pay. And then when you look at the struggle that led to what became the riots the demonstration by the labor movement in 1958, led by Clifford Darling, Bartholomew Bastian of the Hotel Workers Union. Clifford Darling was the president of the Taxi Union, Bartholomew of the Hotel Workers Union, Randall Fox, who was the chair, was the leader of the Longshoremen Union, and their lawyer was Lyndon Pinland. Those were the primary leaders of the 58 strike that won for the workers amendments of the law that ended with better labor laws and having earned the right to have a holiday in their name, Labor Day. It's been renamed the Randall Fox Labor Day. And there were 6 gallant women who fought for the women to have the right to vote, something that the men of the Bahamas, the people of color, fought for over the years against the company vote, the property vote, the fact that it was unfair for people who own a company could vote, but human beings couldn't because they didn't own property. So men had won certain victories in that area. And so by 1967, the election of 67, the seats were so distributed that Sir Lyndon could form a government made up of black people. There was still in 1967 the fact that people living on Abaco and Eleuthera could vote for 3 candidates, and people who lived on certain other islands, Exuma, Cat Island, Long Island, could vote for 2 candidates. But the people in Andros and New Providence, where the bulk of the PLP support would have been, could only vote for 1. By 1968, 1 man, 1 vote. The women won the right to vote in 1959, and they voted in the election of 1962. So the struggle for majority rule, in reality, though a majority government was formed in 67, majority rule by the right of 1 man, 1 vote was not attained until 68. Some years later, we moved in the election of 1972 that the issue for independence would be determined by the vote in the election of 72. Then we went to London with a delegation that reflected the composition of the House of Assembly. There were 15 members in the delegation, and 10 were made up of PLP, 5 FNMs, but it reflected the composition, PLP to FNMs in the House of Assembly. And we had a very successful conference. We dealt effectively with the concerns of the British. We ironed out some concerns. We respected the fact that many people in the country, particularly in the Family Islands, wanted us to retain the monarchy. I think that when, from time to time, somebody would ask me, why did you're a monarchist, man, you retained, you joined with, I said, no, I respected the right of the Bahamian people to determine what they want, and they made that decision, and we respected it. We are now, and all of those events were very defining period in the life of this country and its people. We are faced next year with a very defining period in our Bahamas. We will be able to look back and determine, did we get it right? Did we come up with the right symbols? Because 50 years is time to reflect, to examine. So we must look at many, 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 many things. It isn't just another year. It isn't just another year, 49 this year and 50 years. No, 50 years is a defining period. And all Bahamians, and the government is obliged to look at a lot of things and determine, should we critique it a bit, should we alter it a bit? We should look at our coat of arms. We should look at our flag. That should be black, gold, and aquamarine. But if you look at them lately, they've become black, gold, and a green that is not aqua. So we got to correct those mistakes. We should look at our national anthem and determine whether there are a few words or should be changed, lengthened, or shortened. The version we have now is accredited to Timothy Gibson, a great songwriter, a great Bahamian. But the version we sing is shorter than what Timothy Gibson wrote, because you don't want a national anthem that's too very long. So it was shortened. That was done by Arthur Hanna, who thought he was quite a talented scholar in language, and I didn't know he was a songwriter too. But we should look at that too and determine whether there are some phrases in it that maybe better suited than what we've had. Not that you look at it wanting to change it, but you look at it because you should. We should look at these things. We should decide to look at some institution that grew out of independence. Like, why is it we refer to ourselves as a Christian nation when we're really a secular nation? A nation born out of our spiritual belief, but not our denominational belief. Why is it we don't embrace, for instance, the Greek Orthodox Church? They're not active. They should be. Why is it the other bodies of faith who worship the same God that most Bahamians do seem not to be included? We should look at that and determine whether it's the right thing to do. We should look at something that we have inherited from our colonial past. Every island in the Bahamas have a coat of arms. Eleuthera, Abaco, Andros, Exuma, they all have a coat of arms. We should look at them and determine what ought to be the appropriate coat of arms for Cat Island, for instance. I don't remember precisely what it is now, but it should have the most noted element of Cat Island is Coma Hill, Mount Alvernia, where there's the highest landmass in the Bahamas. Becomes particularly relevant in that Cat Island could claim to be, with all the projected problems of climate change, Coma Hill would be the last one to sink below the sea. Right. If it happens, I think that we ought to look at those things. We ought to build a lasting and appropriate monument to the father of our nation. There is no doubt in the Bahamas that today, even those who fought against us for independence 50 years ago, 50 years and some months ago, against independence, when some of them campaigned saying independence never, there were elements in the FNM saying independence but not now. But the issue is independence. Even those who fought against it today have come to realize the Bahamas didn't sink into the sea, didn't fail and go into oblivion, didn't become a despot like some of the countries they predicted we would become and that we would fail because black people can't govern. We've proven that we could do it.
This special JCN tribute to the life of the late Honorable George A. Smith has been brought to you by the following sponsors: C.A. Christie Real Estate, the Hotel Corporation for the Bahamas, McKinney Bancroft and Hughes, Financial One, McKinney Turner and Company, the Cancer Treatment Centers of America, the Gaming Board of the Bahamas, and the FML Group of Companies.